Thank you for joining us for another webcast. Our registration for the next webcast has just gone live as well. So that is going to be an employment rights bill update. If you've been following the press, if you've been reading things on LinkedIn, you'll see that we're seeing lots of updates coming through, particularly as it's been through the House of Lords and some potential changes. Whether those changes will hold for the final bill, we'll have to wait and see. But we have got the next session, I think, is in August. So hopefully by then we'll have a bit more clarity. I've got my own opinions on what I think is going to happen, given the size of the majority that Labour have. But that should be a really good session to get your next update on the employment rights bill. So we're going to kick off this session. This is quite a chunky topic, and we're looking at really just one element of performance management. It's a huge topic. So if there is a point that we kind of touch on and move past and you think, you know what, I could do with a session on this, drop it in the chat and we can put it into consideration for our future sessions. So performance management, it actually touches on a huge part of our legal framework when it comes to employment law. There's several key pieces of legislation that we have to be mindful of, which means there's also lots of areas that we can trip up on as well. So we've got the Employment Rights Act 1996 for now, until we get the Employment Rights Bill, which sets out the procedures that we have to follow in respect of employee processes and dismissals if we were going to be dismissing someone on capability grounds. We've got the Employment Relations Act, which covers the right to be accompanied when we are issuing formal sanctions. Of course, the Equality Act, where we have those discrimination protections, which invariably becomes an issue when we are dealing with capability issues, because invariably when we're looking at people who've got either sickness absence or their skills have been impacted by medical issues, there's often a disability in play. And then obviously the ACAS Code of Practice. Now, ACAS Code of Practice obviously will be updating in line with the Employment Rights Bill. There's going to be lots of work that goes on with that Code of Practice. So the code that we have currently come to know and love has a limited shelf life, unfortunately. But again, as we get those changes, we will be updating in line with the news pieces that we do on the Employment Rights Bill as well. So it's important that we understand the law that sits behind performance management, because it means that we can't just do what we want where we have performance issues. To make sure that we're not falling foul just of the Employment Rights Act and unfair dismissal law, which can result in I'd say much smaller awards compared to discrimination, but they can still be sizable and difficult to swallow for a business. But if we fall foul of that Equality Act, then we can be facing really, really serious sanctions indeed. So where do we start with when it comes to performance? So one of the most common issues that I used to come across when I was in practice as a contentious lawyer, so doing tribunal work, was where an unfair dismissal would be found because we've selected the wrong process. Now, it sounds very simple. How do we pick the wrong process? How do we get that wrong? Well, it's more common than you would perhaps think. And what some managers struggle with is, should I be taking somebody down a capability route, or should I be taking them down a disciplinary route? And more often than not, we sometimes see employers where there is a significant crossover in terms of the language that's used in policy. So it's really, really important that when we are in a situation where someone can't do something, it's not willful, they just don't have maybe the skills or the qualifications, or their skills haven't developed to where we need them to, or perhaps they've got health conditions that are affecting their ability to do their job, or perhaps there's lack of aptitude, or they're unable to attend work, so there's a capability issue in that respect. That's a can't do, so that would be down a capability route. If we've got someone who won't do something, so this is more willful, so when someone is deliberately refusing to follow procedures, so they're not doing things that we are asking them to do in the way that we're asking them to do because they're deliberately choosing not to. So where we've got an attitude problem or negligence or carelessness, then that could potentially go down that disciplinary process. But I would say that final point around the negligence or carelessness is often where we get that confusion between the two processes. Are we saying someone is careless because actually it's in their personality, they're a bit laissez-faire and, sort of away with the fairies a little bit, so perhaps not keeping their eye on the ball at work? Or is it someone who actually just doesn't care? So they're being careless because they're choosing not to do things properly. And it's there that we can see those lines blurring over which process we should be choosing. Now, incorrect classification can undermine an entire process and it can result in an unfair dismissal. There's a case, the Royal Mail Group and Duty, which is actually often cited as a whistleblowing case. But in this instance, this is where the employer, after the employee had blown the whistle, essentially manufactured a false performance narrative and tried to dismiss this person on performance grounds, and the tribunal very much saw through it. So it's really, really important that if we're taking someone down a process and if we are dismissing someone, that we are doing it under the real reason, that we're not trying to dress things up as something that they're not. Something that, if I've got HR colleagues on this session, we'll often have them nodding their heads, is where we get asked by senior managers, we've got performance individuals with this person, they're a bit of a pain, I don't have time to go through a process that lasts for several months, can I just make them redundant? And tribunals, as I've said, are very, very good at seeing through a situation and identifying the real reason for dismissal. So it is important that we identify what the actual problem is and use the relevant process. Otherwise, we are in line for a procedural unfair dismissal. So first things first is we should always be reverting to informal processes first. So if we jump straight into formal performance management, if we're straight into those warnings and we're straight on the path to dismissal, then it can be seen that we haven't necessarily been as fair with somebody. It could potentially undermine a fair dismissal. And if we don't actually end up dismissing that employee, if we've launched straight into formal proceedings, it could well mean that we have damaged that relationship with the employee. And again, their performance becomes an issue in the future. So before we launch into the formal stuff, there's a poll on the screen now. So how confident are you in your current performance management processes? And the options that we've got for you there are very confident, I'm consistent and it's effective, somewhat confident, there's room for improvement, not confident, our processes need significant changes, or we don't have a clear process in place at all. So I've got a couple of you saying very confident, that's great. Somewhat confident, room for improvement, I like that. There's always room for improvement. I've got one saying we don't have any clear processes in place at all. So hopefully this session is going to be really, really useful for those of you who perhaps need a bit more confidence or want some guidance on what the relevant processes should be. So at this informal stage, early identification, we want to be spotting what are the issues nice and early on. Have some open communication, so it might be feedback sessions, maybe debriefing sessions after projects have completed, and making sure that we are implementing support measures. So we're offering training, supporting, mentoring, coaching, looking at whether there are adjustments that we can apply at this early stage. Now, the reason why I'm a big advocate of the informal approach to start with is you may well have in your mind why someone is not performing very well or why there are issues. And actually, you could be wrong. It could be that you have got an employee who's using the wrong resources, they're speaking to the wrong people, they're taking their knowledge from the wrong places, they're learning bad habits and bad skills from somebody else. So let's identify nice and early if there are any quick fixes that we can do to improve performance. Now, I've recently just come off a training series where I've been training in a London City law firm where we've had senior associates who've been made up to partners. And there's something that I always talk to, particularly within the legal field, to partners about when I'm delivering this training is we should always start with ourselves as managers. Actually, is it something that I am doing? Am I not briefing this person correctly? Have I not trained them appropriately to do this role? Have I given them everything that they need to do to be able to do this role properly? If we're not briefing, if we're not setting goals clearly, communicating properly, it could well be that someone is doing the best that they can with the information that they've got. So do that self-reflection first, have this informal stage and get to the bottom of it before we then launch into formal processes. Because it can be much more difficult to climb down if we get into a formal process and realize actually that we're the problem. So a formal performance improvement process, what that should look like. So when we haven't secured improvement through an informal stage, we would then go into an investigation stage. So we should then be gathering facts about performance issues. So what are the potential causes? What are the training needs? What are the personal circumstances or health concerns? What else could be impacting this individual? Let's get together our appraisals, any other performance reviews that we've got, anything that we can essentially lay our hands on that is going to give us that balanced view about this person's performance. And you'll notice I said balance there. This is not a fishing expedition where we're going looking for evidence of poor performance. It could be that you're in a senior position and it's been reported by a line manager to you that someone is underperforming. And when actually you look at the documentation, think actually the performance is fine, but I feel this person's being micromanaged, or perhaps the line manager doesn't like them and they're looking for an avenue to remove them. So it's really, really important at this investigation stage that we get our facts straight and understand what it is that we are looking at. A formal review hearing, so making sure that after we've gathered all that information that we are then preparing for a formal performance meeting or a formal performance hearing. Now, in preparation for this, I would often be scrutinizing those appraisals and performance reviews, because invariably, and this is a real pet hate of mine, if there's any HR on the chat, feel free to drop a thumbs up in if this happens to you, is when you are asked either to hold a performance improvement process or you've been asked to advise on it. So you say, great, yep, send me the appraisals of the person who is the poor performer, and you'll see that they've been ticked as very good in everything and awarded a pay rise, typically because the line managers haven't engaged properly in that appraisal process. And when you challenge them on it, they say, oh, there were issues, but I couldn't have the difficult conversation at the time. They had lots going on. There were issues in their marriage, or I was just so busy. I only had 10 minutes to get this appraisal done before I needed to do another 50 of them. And there is always an excuse. Now, ultimately, and this again is a key piece of advice I always come back to, is tribunals are won on documentation and they are lost on witnesses. If we're going to put several very good appraisals in front of a judge and then use a witness to try and convince that judge that this person's an underperformer, we're probably going to lose. The documentation has to reflect the reality of the situation. So if we have people who are not completing appraisals properly, if we're not using that appraisal process effectively, again, this is, are we the problem? We need to go back to basics and make sure that the day-to-day performance monitoring stuff that we have in place is being done properly. Now, if this all sounds very, very overwhelming, and this isn't a sales pitch, by the way, but if this does sound overwhelming and you think, where am I going to find all this documentation? How do I do investigations, capability meetings? She's now talking about formal hearings and appraisals and doing it all properly. I can mention our system later on, which will help you to get all this sort of stuff straight if you don't have this already in place. So at that formal hearing, we're going to talk to that employee about their performance. We're going to tell them what the issues are, and we're going to be trying to set out what it is that we want them to achieve and when. And this is when we then put that performance improvement plan in place. So we're going to be setting SMART objectives. These are specific. So specifically, this is what we need you to do. It's measurable. So this is how we're going to judge whether or not it's been successful or not. It has to be achievable. We can't set these as super stretch targets or things that are fundamentally unachievable, because then the plan's not fair. It's got to be relevant to their role, and we need to be putting deadlines on them, and equally those deadlines need to be fair. So a nice structured plan with each goal set out in that format is a really, really strong way to set up a PIP. So we define the review period. So typically that can be 4 to 12 weeks in between reviews. It could be more, it could be less, depending on the situation and the skills that we're asking someone to improve. We meet at the review. So we have a regular review and we go through every single objective, and we're going to be noting down, has there been improvement? Has it stayed the same? Has it got worse? And then we're going to reset those objectives. So if it hasn't improved, let's set some more goals. This is what we need to see in this period. And this is, again, following that SMART structure. Now, ultimately, this doesn't go on forever. So if we have someone who is consistently not doing very well on that PIP and their performance isn't improving, or we haven't got confidence that we're going to see sustained improvement, then we may well get to the point where we start to issue performance warnings. So I'm not a fan of issuing one at the first performance review meeting. Someone's probably settling into a plan, getting used to being on the PIP and perhaps working in a different way. And remember, tribunals always come back to what is reasonable, what was reasonable in the circumstances, not just what was reasonable for the business, but what was reasonable for the employee in this situation. So making sure that we are giving that sufficient time for someone to improve and putting relevant support in place as well. And then if we're not seeing that improvement, that we then have those ladder of warnings. So we have the first warning, a final warning before we then get to dismissal. Now, it's something that I will always say consistently, which is when we are dismissing someone on the grounds of capability, it should never, ever come as a surprise to that individual. The writing should have been on the wall for a while. They should have warnings on file. They should be acknowledging that their performance hasn't been very good. And they've been through such a structured and supportive process with the relevant communication being issued that it should never come as a shock once they get to that dismissal stage. So as we've said, we have the relevant procedural steps: first written warning, final written warning, and then we consider dismissal. And the relevant case here that I'm going to refer to is Poor and British Telecom, and this is where a PIP was applied when it essentially shouldn't have done. The employer here should have been looking at reasonable adjustments. They should have been following occupational health advice, and there was very, very poor guidance for line managers about what they should be doing within this process, and ultimately it was an unfair dismissal. Now, we've talked about dismissal a lot, and as you can see on the screen, we're laddering up these warnings to get to dismissal. And it's really, really important that we remember that performance improvement plans and performance management isn't just around working people out of a business. Performance improvement should also just be around performance improvement. So we could put someone on a PIP if we want to support them towards promotion, for example, if they want to learn skills in a different area and perhaps move to a different part of the business. And tribunals are also very, very good at spotting the difference between a negative performance plan that is designed to move someone out of the business and one that is actually genuinely trying to improve someone's performance. So we should always, as a matter of course, be at that starting point of we are trying to improve your performance. We are trying to make this work, rather than in that first meeting it being a case of, well, if you don't pass this plan, then you're out. Because we're starting in that mindset of, well, we've already got our framework to dismissal set out and we're just waiting for you to fail. So back to that reasonableness, think about this as a positive process and communicate it in this way. We're putting you on this plan so that we can help you to perform, we can help you to get better, rather than thinking about it as a way of managing somebody out of a business. So legal requirements for fair dismissal, a bit of a reminder here. So we need to have reasonable belief that someone is incapable of performing their role to the required standard. So that reasonable belief needs to be based on appropriate investigation and documentation. So we need to be showing that we were reasonable in starting that process, that the PIP itself, that we've put that person on that performance improvement plan, has also been reasonable. We haven't been pushing someone too hard, too fast, or we've not been jumping the gun by saying, actually, we don't think you're capable of doing the role. And something else that I have seen in practice quite a lot is I will get a file put in front of me where someone has failed a PIP and so they have been dismissed. And when I'm reading the PIP, it actually only relates to about 5-10% of this person's role. So is it reasonable to say in that situation that this person is incapable of performing that role to the required standard? So actually thinking about, well, how crucial are these skills? Is this something where we can modify this role? Or actually, are we reasonable in saying just because someone can't do a part of it, that we believe that they are fundamentally incapable of performing the role? So we've got to be very, very careful around this reasonable belief element, because it is quite a difficult burden for us to pass. We've got to show that we've given support and given the opportunity to improve. We've got to make sure that we're following that ACAS code of practice. So if somebody raises a grievance, that we are following those processes as well. We don't just kick a grievance out just because someone's on a performance improvement plan or because they're complaining about the performance improvement plan. We can deal with those side by side, or even indeed pause that PIP if reasonable, and making sure that when we are inviting people to meetings, that we are putting this in writing. That can be an email. We're giving the right to somebody to have that companion, the statutory companion, so a colleague or a trade union rep, where there's the potential for a sanction to be issued, and that we give the right of appeal. And we should always, at all times, be considering all alternatives to dismissal. Can we redeploy into a more suitable role? Could we even look at demotion for this person? Are there any adjustments that we can make before we get to termination? So what about health and disability then? So this is where things start to get much more complex when it comes to performance management. Is invariably, once a performance management process starts, is an employee may well disclose that they have got health issues at that point. Now, something employers will often say to me is, well, they didn't declare this when they started work, and they signed a form to say that there was nothing wrong with them when they joined my business. I feel like they are playing the health card. Well, unfortunately, that's not going to sway anybody. If someone is suffering with health issues or a disability that is impacting their performance, their capability, we should pause that process. So temporarily suspend formal proceedings and get to the bottom of what the medical situation is. So it might be that we go to occupational health. It might be that we ask for a report from the GP. We need to understand what it is that is going on with this person and how it is impacting their performance. We'll do an evaluation to see if somebody's health does meet the definition of disability. But my advice here always is, if we're not sure, treat them as if the protection applies, because it's always going to be lower risk in terms of making sure that we're not falling foul of the Equality Act. It's always better to overdo it in this situation than it is to underdo it and be liable for discrimination. And remember, in putting reasonable adjustments in place, even when you don't have the legal obligation to do so, from a cultural perspective, is always going to be much more positive from an employee experience. So the case I refer to here, Griffiths and Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, is where the Court of Appeal confirmed that employers must make reasonable adjustments to absence management procedures for disabled employees. So in this situation, the employee had post-viral fatigue and fibromyalgia, and the tribunal found that there was a duty to make adjustments to that process, so that we pause things, that we extend review periods, that we don't just march somebody through a process in the same way as we do for other employees. So we've got a question: how do you feel about without prejudice conversation to avoid the pain on both sides when PIPs just don't work out? Yeah, I mean, without prejudice conversations or protected conversations are always a useful tool. What I would say is, if we jump in very early on with them, it kind of gives the employee the heads up that either we think that they're going to fail or that we don't want them anymore. And then if they say no to that conversation, they're going to become very difficult through that process. They're probably going to take legal advice, and it's going to become even more painful. So what I would usually suggest is, unless the employee has raised it first, don't do it early doors. But further down the line, if we can see that the employee is struggling with that process and we're not really seeing much improvement, then yes, it is a tool that we can use. What we do need to be mindful of under Employment Rights Bill, you may have seen that the law is potentially going to change around us being able to use settlement agreements to settle harassment claims. Is that it's not unusual for somebody who is pleading discrimination to say that actually the performance improvement plan itself was an act of harassment, and we would no longer be able to settle those claims if that law comes in. Now, we're still obviously waiting to see the extent of that and whether, that this is going to come in relation to harassment, but it could well mean that we lose our ability, where somebody has a disability, to settle these matters via settlement agreements. There's just something to be aware of there. So avoiding discrimination claims. So performance management has got to be applied fairly to avoid discrimination. We've got the 9 protected characteristics on screen, and now we've got to remember it's not just disability that can be in play here. Typically, it more often than not is, but where you have got someone perhaps who is advancing in age, it could well be that their age is the reason why that their performance isn't up to scratch. If someone was going through gender reassignment, it's a very emotional and physically it's a physical process that somebody might be going through that could be affecting their their performance. If someone's fallen pregnant or coming back from maternity leave, or if someone, for example, is experiencing racial bullying, there are many reasons why somebody might not be performing very well that could still land us with a discrimination risk. So it's really important that we don't just get that tunnel vision in relation to disability, and that if someone doesn't have a disability, that we think that we're safe from discrimination claims, because there could be a bigger picture in play, which is why I always reinforce those points about that early investigation and making sure that we're doing those informal conversations first. Not forgetting the basics, we've got the right to be accompanied when we are taking somebody to a meeting where there is going to be potentially a formal warning or other sanction. So they've got the right to a work colleague, trade union rep, or a certified union official. If they're bringing someone external, you can ask for a trade union rep to bring ID and proof of affiliation, because it's not totally unknown for people to try and sneak lawyers into these meetings and pretend that they're trade union reps. And make sure that we have a real appeals process. So where we are absolutely looking at this decision with a cold, objective view, ideally from somebody more senior, that we're not just reinforcing the decision that has been made by the original decision-making officer. In Talent Engineering and Smith, the dismissal was deemed unfair when an employer refused to postpone a hearing to accommodate the employee's union representative availability. So employees do have the right to one postponement. And in that case, the tribunal found that it wasn't going to cause an unreasonable delay. There was no reason why the employer couldn't have allowed it. So whilst it might feel that somebody is playing the game or they're just trying to defer the inevitable, always take the view of how is this going to look to somebody from an objective standpoint, and am I being reasonable? So let's have a look at what your current performance management practices are. So we've got a poll on the screen. So what are you currently doing? Regular one-to-one check-ins, formal annual reviews, 360-degree feedback, goal-setting frameworks, for example, OKRs, SMART goals, or performance improvement plans. We've got some 360 reviews going on, regular one-to-one check-ins, annual reviews. Okay, so we've got more one-to-one check-ins. Okay, so one-to-one check-ins, that's good. Hopefully we are keeping documentation for one-to-one check-ins, or at the very least sending emails after one-to-ones just confirming what we've talked about, because that is a trap that I see people fall into. They have great processes around actually doing one-to-ones, and they do them consistently, but very little documentation around them. So that doesn't need to be really heavy documentation, but at the very least a quick summary of what was discussed. So lessons from those tribunal cases that we've mentioned so far, making sure that we've got that procedural fairness. Have a look at what your procedures are at the moment around performance management. What are you doing day to day to monitor performance? Are you having that space for informal check-ins if things are going wrong before we have that formal process? And do you understand what the extent of your formal process is? Make sure that we are implementing support for employees. So where we have got someone who is struggling, that we go to practical support first before we launch into those improvement plans. Make sure we are maintaining documentation, and make sure that we are considering reasonable adjustments appropriately. So the consequences of getting it wrong, so the financial penalties, and actually the figure says 22-23, but actually it's pretty accurate to 2024 as well. The average unfair dismissal award was 13,704. I think it was 13,775 last year. However, the largest unfair dismissal award to date was 179,000. So while that average may feel relatively low in terms of, when we look at discrimination claims and things like that, the highest award was over 170 grand. So it's really, really important that we make sure that we are doing this properly. So we've got a question down in the chat from Joe. So does your software allow you to record all performance management reviews? Yes, it does. So we'll actually have a quick look now at what our system can do to support you with this. So within our software, for anyone not familiar, we have a full performance management suite. So here we're logging into the system. This is the dashboard that would present a manager, and we're going to click down here to performance management. You can see we can set goals, we can measure performance, we can do reviews. reviews. So when we look to perform a review, we can do appraisals, we can see who's done what's been submitted, what's been completed. When we want to measure performance, in this section, we've got the ability to set KPIs. We've got guidance on the right-hand side to talk you through it. And then we can also set a formal PIP, which is what we're going to do here. So we've set the review. It's on an individual basis, and we're going to put the goals in here now. So we've got the long-term goal, which is to improve customer-related performance and sales data. And we're going to set our first individual goal. So we're going to be specific. We want to improve communication. We've got the skills that we need the employee to work on and the specific action we want, how that success is being judged, and when we want it to be done by. We're also then going to set a second goal to help us reach that overarching aim, so increasing engagement in this one, and we can see that detail going in. And once I've finished with my very fast type, this isn't the, as you can tell, it's pre-recorded. We can then see the PIP set out like this in that tabular format. So here we've got the long-term goal on the left, improve that customer-related performance, the individual goals in column 2, the skills we need that person to work on, what specific actions are required, how success will be judged, and when it needs to be done by. We can then review that in the review section. So we can see here this manager's got lots of performance reviews to do because it's in our test system. You click on review, and we can see here we can select whether something has been completed in the meeting, or if it's unachievable, if it's still in progress, and then we can put any feedback in after that meeting. We can then set further deadlines, and this will then bounce back to that employee for the employee to put their notes and their feedback in as well, and we'll say this one's been achieved. If we then decide that we're going to complete a plan, we can then reopen it. We can look, we can view, we can open something back up again. So we can reopen this one if we've decided that actually something hasn't been completed, and we can manage those in these nice handy drop-down boxes as well in there. Now, that really was a very quick sort of fly through just one element of our performance management section of the software. We have got the ability in there to set SMART goals. We can set OKRs, KPIs. As we've shown the PIP, we've got an appraisal builder, so you can use our appraisals, you can build your own. And then we've also got some custom performance management settings as well, if you want to be a bit more flexible about how you do it. If that was a bit fast for you, I appreciate we covered quite a lot there. Feel free to book on with a demo for us, and we're happy to take you through that in a much more detailed format as well. So best practice recommendations, clear documentation, so maintaining up-to-date job descriptions is crucial. We can also do that within the software as well, and making sure that we are documenting everything that we're doing and that we've got up-to-date capability policies. So we do all of that for you within our software. We've got the policies in there, we've got the job description builders, and it documents that performance management process in a really detailed way and holds everything in that document repository. Make sure that we are training managers. If we're putting someone in the position of being a manager, make sure they have the skills to do it. Make sure that they can performance manage people. Make sure that people are getting regular feedback. And I don't mean feedback as just telling someone they've done something wrong. The feedback exercise can be a very, very powerful tool for improving performance. So making sure that we are debriefing properly with people, that we are being constructive about what we say. If we just praise people, saying, oh, good job, that doesn't tell us anything. If we say rubbish job, that doesn't tell us anything either. We need to be going into detail with people in that feedback exercise. And make sure that we are being consistent, that we're not just picking on one person, that we are making sure that we have got a really robust, consistent application of performance management across our business. So key takeaways, we've covered a lot in this session, making sure that we are focusing on improvement. These should be positive improvement processes. Make sure that when you are taking someone through a process that we are legally compliant. Early intervention is essential. If we leave someone who isn't performing and we just let the situation become toxic and we get to the point where actually they're entirely incapable, what we could have intervened earlier and supported them, we're going to get criticized. Having a fair process protects everybody. It's not just employees. It's really, really important to protect your business, particularly with the changes that are going to be upcoming over the next couple of years. So if you have questions or if you've got further support, there's always the ACAS Code of Practice. You can always come to us for a free consultation. If you've been on this session, we're more than happy to give you a bit of time afterwards if you need to go through anything. Do check out the legislation. You might find it's an easier read than perhaps anticipated. And there's lots and lots of guidance online as well. This webcast is recorded, so if you need to go through, watch bits again or watch it a bit more slowly, then please feel free to do so. And also, if you do want to have a look at that system, make sure that you book a demo with us. I think we've got a clickable link on here somewhere where our wonderful sales team can take you through our comprehensive system that will help you to reduce your compliance issues and hopefully save you a bit of money. So how can we help? HR software. We also do HR consultancy, and we also offer CPD verified e-learning. If you are a HR consultant and you're looking for a bit of extra help, we do offer a white label service as well to help you with your business and help your business growth. And then if actually you're all set up, you've got everything you need, but you just like the content that we produce, then go and have a listen to the podcast. We are a top 20 UK HR podcast, and those episodes drop every other week, and we cover everything that from within the HR world. So weird and wonderful queries that I get in. We've got some great ones that are about to drop. So I think we had an episode come down this week, and I touched on at the beginning of the session the difference between someone who can't do something and won't do something. And we do have an episode coming up around, how far, what can we actually ask employees to do? What are the worst jobs that some employees have been asked to do or refuse to do? So there's some really kind of relevant content coming out around that. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for coming on to this session. And thank you for doing the polls and engaging with us as always. If you have anything that you would like us to cover in future sessions, please don't hesitate to reach out to the team. That is everything from me this morning. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you on future sessions.